The iron rails pressed cold against Zara Harper's spine. Her wrists burned where the rope cut deep. The locomotive's whistle pierced the dawn air like a death song. She tested the bonds again. No give. The vibration beneath her grew stronger with each heartbeat. Dust motes danced in the amber light that stretched across the Sierra Nevada peaks. This was calculated. This was punishment. The settlement of Copper Ridge lay 2 miles behind her, nestled in the valley where freed slaves and settlers had carved homes from unforgiving stone, where children learned letters in a one-room schoolhouse, where Sunday hymns rose with the smoke from cooking fires, all of it about to become memory. Zara closed her eyes and felt the approaching thunder in her bones. The train would round Devil's Bend in minutes. She had spent years tracking through these mountains, reading signs that others missed. Now she could read her own ending in the trembling earth. The rope had been tied by someone who knew knots, someone who understood that hope was cruelest when it lingered. Her fingers found no purchase on the smooth hemp. Blood slicked her palms. She had discovered too much, seen too much. The documents hidden in Cartwright's survey camp told a story of greed that stretched beyond Copper Ridge, beyond reason. Land seizures masked as legal transfers. Families relocated at gunpoint under false federal orders. Communities erased to make way for railroad expansion. The whistle sounded again, closer now. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that rose from the warming rocks, free in a way she would never be again. Her brother Marcus had died 5 years ago in what they called a cavalry raid. His body never recovered. His horse returned riderless to the fort with blood on the saddle. She had grieved him as a soldier fallen in service. Now she wondered if he had died for different reasons, if he had seen what she had seen. The vibration intensified, metal singing against metal somewhere beyond the bend. She could smell the smoke now, coal-thick and bitter. Sheriff Dutch Hawkins had seemed like salvation when she brought him the documents 3 days ago. His weathered face had shown the right concern. His questions had sounded careful, professional. He promised to contact federal marshals who could act on evidence of fraud. Instead, he had led her here. The meeting was supposed to happen at dawn near the tracks. A federal contact would take the evidence and begin an investigation. She had trusted Hawkins completely. He had helped other families navigate legal troubles. He had stood with them against claim jumpers and cattle thieves. She should have read the silence in his eyes. Cartwright's men had been waiting in the rocks when she arrived. 6 of them, armed and ready. No federal contact, no investigation, just rope and iron and the promise of an oncoming train. Edmund Cartwright himself had watched from horseback as they bound her to the rails. His pale eyes held no emotion. He spoke of progress and inevitability, of obstacles that needed removing. His voice carried the weight of money and influence that could buy sheriffs and silence witnesses. The train's headlamp cut through the morning haze, a bright eye searching the track ahead. She could hear the chuff of the engine now, the squeal of wheels taking the curve. Copper Ridge would learn of her death by accident, a tragic mishap. Perhaps she had been walking the tracks in the early morning and slipped. Perhaps she had been overcome by grief for her brother and chosen this end herself. Stories could be crafted. Truth could be buried beneath sympathy and speculation. The families she had tried to protect would face relocation within weeks. Their homes would burn in convenient accidents. Their children would scatter to wherever charity could house them. The railroad would claim the land through legal channels that no one would question. Marcus had always said she was too stubborn for her own good, too willing to stand when wisdom suggested kneeling. She had tracked wounded animals through blizzards rather than let them suffer. She had faced down claim jumpers with nothing but determination and a hunting rifle. Now her stubbornness would die with her on these rails. The ground shook with mechanical thunder. She could see the locomotive now, black smoke billowing from its stack. The engineer would spot her soon. Too soon to stop. Physics and momentum would finish what Cartwright had started. She thought of the children in Copper Ridge learning their letters, of the gardens that would bloom this spring, of the church bell that called families to worship each Sunday. All of it measured now in minutes. The whistle screamed across the valley, warning of death that could not be prevented. The shadow fell across her first. Then the blade. A figure emerged from the morning mist, tall enough to block the sun. His knife cut through the rope with 3 precise strokes. Strong hands pulled her from the rails as the locomotive thundered past, wind and smoke washing over them both. Zara rolled into the gravel beside the track, gasping. Her rescuer stood 7 feet if he stood an inch. Comanche by the look of him, though his clothes mixed tribal leather with settler cotton. His face held the weathered calm of someone who had seen too much death to fear it. He said nothing, offered no explanation. Just watched the train disappear around the far curve, its whistle fading into mountain silence. She struggled to her feet, wrists still burning from the rope. Her legs shook but held. The stranger's eyes found hers briefly, then moved to scan the rocks above them, listening for pursuit that would come. That was when she saw it. The medallion at his throat caught the early light, silver etched with a cavalry insignia. Marcus's medallion, the one he had worn through 2 tours of duty, the one that should have been buried with him 5 years ago. Ice formed in her chest despite the warming air. The distant sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon walls. Cartwright's men riding hard toward the tracks. The Comanche heard it too. He turned without a word and began climbing the steep slope beside the rails. His movements held the fluid grace of someone who belonged in wild places. Zara followed. She had no choice. Death waited behind them, and this stranger had saved her life. Even if he wore her brother's medal around his neck. They climbed through scrub pine and granite outcroppings. The hoofbeats grew louder below. Voices shouted orders, though the words were lost in echo. The Comanche never looked back, never slowed his pace. His moccasins found purchase where her boots slipped on loose stone. At the ridge top he finally stopped. The valley spread below them, copper ridge visible in the distance. Smoke rose from breakfast fires. Children would be waking soon, preparing for another day of school and chores and the simple business of living. All of it balanced on a knife's edge. The Comanche studied her face with dark eyes that missed nothing. He was deciding something, measuring her worth perhaps, determining if she could be trusted with whatever knowledge he carried. Zara met his gaze without flinching. Let him see what she was, what she had always been, someone who stood when others fell, someone who bled for principle rather than bend for comfort. The riders below had reached the tracks. 6 men on horseback, searching the gravel for sign. Sheriff Hawkins among them, his badge catching sunlight. His betrayal still burned fresh in her memory. The Comanche touched the medallion at his throat, a gesture so brief she almost missed it, but the meaning was clear. He knew she had seen it. New questions would follow. They moved deeper into the mountains, following game trails that wound between towering pines. The air grew thin and sharp. Ravens called from hidden perches, their voices carrying warnings across the peaks. Hours passed in silence. The stranger set a punishing pace, never stopping to rest. Zara's legs ached and her lungs burned, but she kept up. Pride demanded it. Survival required it. Near midday, they reached a sheltered grove beside a mountain stream. The Comanche finally allowed himself to stop. He knelt by the water and drank deeply, then stepped aside so she could do the same. The cold water eased her throat but not her questions. Marcus's medallion hung heavy in her thoughts. How had this man come to wear it? What had happened in that cavalry raid 5 years ago? What secrets died with her brother in some unnamed canyon? The Comanche settled against a fallen log and watched her with patient eyes. He understood her suspicion, expected it even, but he offered no explanations. No easy words to bridge the gap between them. Below in the valley, smoke began to rise from multiple points. Not cooking fires this time, something larger, more deliberate. Zara's heart clenched as she recognized the pattern. Buildings burning, homes turning to ash. Cartwright was not waiting for her death to be confirmed. He was moving against Copper Ridge immediately. Families who had done nothing wrong were paying the price for her defiance. The Comanche saw the smoke too. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand moved to rest on the knife at his belt. Whatever connected him to this fight ran deeper than chance encounter. A new sound reached them through the mountain air. The whistle of another train, this one heading toward Copper Ridge. Supplies for the railroad crew, perhaps, or reinforcements for Cartwright's men. Either way, it meant more pressure on the settlement. 48 hours. That was what Cartwright had promised. 48 hours for the families to pack what they could carry and abandon everything else. Leave their homes, their gardens, their carefully built lives. Scatter to wherever charity might shelter them. Unless someone stopped him first. The Comanche stood and began walking again, deeper into the mountains, away from the burning valley. Zara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to help her people fight the fires, to stand with them against whatever came next. But she was one woman with empty hands and powerful enemies. Cartwright had the sheriff, the railroad, and enough money to buy whatever additional help he needed. Her death would accomplish nothing except to remove the last witness to his crimes. The stranger paused and looked back at her. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. He was not running from the fight. He was preparing for it. She followed him into the deeper mountains, carrying questions that burned hotter than the smoke behind them. They climbed for 3 hours through country that belonged to wind and stone. The Comanche moved through the terrain with quiet certainty, finding paths that existed only in memory and instinct. Zara followed, her breathing harsh in the thin air. Behind them, the smoke had thickened. Black columns rose from the valley floor, carrying the dreams of families into empty sky. Each plume marked another life disrupted, another home lost to Cartwright's hunger for land. The stranger finally stopped at a granite shelf that overlooked miles of wilderness. Ancient pines clung to impossible slopes. A hawk circled far below, riding thermals that spoke of spaces too vast for ownership. He settled against the rock face and studied her with eyes that held depths she could not read. The medallion caught afternoon light, Marcus's name etched clear on the silver surface. Questions burned in her throat, but she waited. This man would speak when he chose to speak. The wind carried sounds from the distant valley, shouting voices, the crack of falling timber, dogs barking in confusion as familiar scents turned to ash. Cartwright was thorough in his destruction. Zara pulled the leather pouch from inside her jacket. The documents crackled as she spread them on the stone between them. Survey maps, property deeds with forged signatures, orders bearing false federal seals, the paper trail of a conspiracy that reached beyond Copper Ridge. The Comanche leaned forward. His eyes moved across the pages with understanding. He could read then, had education beyond what most expected from a warrior of the plains. His finger traced routes marked on the survey maps, following railroad plans that carved through sacred lands. She had spent months gathering this evidence, sneaking into Cartwright's camp after dark, copying documents by moonlight, photographing papers with equipment borrowed from the settlement's traveling photographer. Each piece of proof had cost her sleep and safety. The stranger reached into his own pack and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside lay more documents, letters bearing Cartwright's signature, bills of sale for weapons marked as farming equipment, correspondence with men whose names appeared in wanted circulars. Their evidence overlapped, different pieces of the same poisonous puzzle. Cartwright was not simply seizing land for railroad expansion. He was running guns to hostile forces, planning to blame the violence on peaceful tribes. Federal intervention would follow, clearing even more territory for his enterprises. The Comanche's jaw tightened as he studied her maps. One finger stopped at a mark near the Washita River. His homeland, perhaps. The place where his people had built their lives before Cartwright's schemes scattered them to the wind. They worked in silence as shadows lengthened across the mountains, comparing documents, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a case that could bring down the railroad baron if it ever reached honest federal hands. The stranger's movements held careful precision. He handled papers with the reverence of someone who understood their power, who knew that truth committed to paper could topple empires or save lives, depending on who controlled the telling. As evening approached, he built a small fire in a sheltered depression. The flames would be invisible from below, hidden by the rock walls. He moved with practiced efficiency, gathering dry wood that would burn without smoke. Zara studied his face in the firelight. Weathered skin spoke of years under open sky. Scars on his hands told stories of battles fought and survived. But his eyes held something beyond warfare, a sadness that ran deeper than personal loss. The medallion reflected flame as he tended the fire. Marcus had been proud of that piece of silver, had polished it until it gleamed, had spoken of honor and duty and serving something greater than himself. Now it hung around the neck of a man who should have been his enemy. The Comanche finally looked up from the flames, met her gaze directly for the first time since the rescue. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps, or acceptance that their separate wars had become one fight. He reached into his pack again and withdrew a piece of hardtack, broke it in half and offered her a portion. The gesture carried weight beyond simple courtesy. Sharing food meant trust, meant alliance in the face of common enemies. They ate in silence while darkness settled over the mountains. Stars emerged one by one, cold points of light in an indifferent sky. Somewhere below, families huddled around their own fires, wondering if morning would bring soldiers or salvation. The stranger banked the coals and settled against his saddle. Sleep would come hard on stone ground, but rest was necessary. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could not be made by exhausted minds. Zara wrapped herself in her coat and found a place against the warming rock. Questions still burned in her thoughts. Marcus's medallion, the perfect timing of her rescue, the way this man had known exactly where to find documents that matched her own investigation. But trust had to start somewhere, had to grow from shared hardship and common cause. This Comanche had saved her life when death seemed certain, had risked his own safety to pull her from those rails, had shared his evidence without being asked. Whatever connected him to Marcus, whatever secrets lay buried in that cavalry raid 5 years past, could wait for morning light. Tonight she would sleep beside a man who wore her brother's medal but fought the same enemies. The wind whispered through the pines above them, carrying smoke and ash from the valley below. By dawn, Copper Ridge might be nothing but memory and regret, unless two unlikely allies could find a way to turn paper evidence into justice. The stranger's breathing deepened into sleep. Zara stared up at stars that had watched over these mountains long before railroads and land grants, and the endless hunger of men for things that belonged to others. She slept finally, dreaming of Marcus and medallions and trains that carried more than passengers through the darkness. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains. Smoke still rose from the valley, thinner now but persistent. The fires had burned through the night, consuming what remained of hope in Copper Ridge. Zara woke to find the Comanche already awake, staring down at the distant settlement. His face held the stillness of carved stone, but his hands gripped the medallion at his throat. Marcus's medallion. She could not wait any longer. The question came out harder than she intended. Raw with 5 years of grief and the fresh betrayal of trusted friends. Her voice carried across the morning silence with the weight of accusation. "Where did you get my brother's medal?" He turned slowly, met her eyes without flinching. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken histories and the distant sound of wind through pine branches. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful cadence of someone choosing each word with precision. "Marcus Harper was my partner, my friend. He died saving my sister from Cartwright's men." The words hit her chest harder than physical blows. Marcus had not died in a cavalry raid, had not fallen in some meaningless skirmish on the plains. He had died fighting the same enemy that now threatened Copper Ridge. The Comanche reached into his pack and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft deer hide. Inside lay more documents, but also personal items. Marcus's journal, the leather cover worn smooth by familiar hands, a photograph of their family taken before the war, a letter addressed to her in Marcus's careful script. He spoke of you often, said you were the strongest person he knew, said you would finish what we started if anything happened to him. Zara's hands shook as she took the journal. The pages fell open to entries written in her brother's familiar hand, descriptions of meetings with a Comanche warrior named Koa Lonefeather, plans to document Cartwright's crimes, growing friendship between two men who should have been enemies. The partnership had begun by accident, Marcus tracking stolen cavalry horses, Koa seeking justice for his village's destruction. Both trails led to the same source. Cartwright's network of corruption stretched from the railroad to the military to the tribal agencies that decided life and death for entire peoples. They had worked together for months, the soldier and the warrior, united by shared purpose, gathering evidence, mapping the conspiracy, building a case that could bring justice if they could find honest federal officers to receive it. The journal entries grew more urgent toward the end. Cartwright's men were getting suspicious. Time was running short. Marcus had written of a final meeting, a chance to rescue Koa's sister from the work camp where captured tribal women labored under guard. The last entry was brief. If something happens to me, find Zara. Give her everything, she will know what to do. Koa's voice was quiet when he continued the story. Your brother kept his word. He got Singing Bird out of that camp, but Cartwright's men were waiting. Marcus made sure she reached safety before they surrounded him. The medallion had been Marcus's final gift, a token of friendship and trust, passed to Koa as he lay dying in a canyon that would become his unmarked grave. Along with it came a promise: find his sister, protect her, finish the work they had started together. Zara pressed the journal against her chest and felt 5 years of grief reshape itself into something harder. Marcus had not died as a victim. He had died as a hero, fighting for people who had no other champions. His death had meaning beyond military service or family pride. The smoke from Copper Ridge grew thicker as more buildings caught fire. Cartwright was accelerating his timeline, using her supposed death as excuse to move against the settlement immediately. Families who had trusted in law and order were learning the bitter truth about purchased justice. Koa stood and began packing his gear with methodical efficiency. The weapons shipment comes through tomorrow night. Railroad car marked as farming equipment. If we can intercept it, document what is inside, we have proof that cannot be denied. The plan was dangerous beyond measure. Cartwright's men would be guarding the shipment. The terrain favored defenders over attackers. Success would require precision, timing, and luck that had abandoned them both in recent days. But it was their only chance. The documents they had gathered told a compelling story, but conspiracies could be explained away by clever lawyers. Physical evidence was different. Illegal weapons bearing Cartwright's shipping marks would be impossible to dismiss. Zara tucked Marcus's journal inside her jacket, close to her heart. Her brother's words would travel with her into whatever came next. His courage would guide her through the darkness ahead. They began the descent toward the valley, moving through country that offered little cover. Koa led the way, finding paths between the rocks that would hide their approach. His knowledge of the terrain spoke of careful scouting, months of preparation for a moment that might never come. The medallion caught sunlight as he moved. Marcus's gift, worn with honor by a man who understood its weight. The bond between them had transcended the artificial divisions that set soldier against warrior, white against red, order against chaos. That same bond now connected her to this quiet giant who had pulled her from the rails. Brotherhood forged in shared loss and common purpose. Trust built on the foundation of Marcus's sacrifice and the evidence that two unlikely partners had died together. By midday they could smell the smoke clearly. Burnt wood and scorched earth, the destruction of dreams measured in ash and memory. Somewhere in that haze, families were making impossible choices about what could be saved and what must be abandoned. 24 hours remained before Cartwright's ultimatum expired. 24 hours to turn evidence into justice, conspiracy into consequence. 24 hours to honor the dead by protecting the living. Koa paused at a ridge overlooking the railroad tracks. Steel rails gleamed in the afternoon sun, carrying the promise of progress and the reality of destruction. Tomorrow night, those same rails would bring weapons meant to justify warfare against innocent people. Unless two grieving allies could find the strength to stop a train, they reached Copper Ridge as the sun touched the western peaks. The settlement bore the scars of Cartwright's warning. 3 buildings reduced to blackened timber. Families huddled around wagons packed with salvaged possessions. Children clutched dolls and quilts, their eyes wide with confusion. Zara's heart clenched at the sight. These people had built something beautiful from nothing, had carved hope from wilderness and raised their children to believe in tomorrow. Now they faced exile because she had dared to stand against power. Koa touched her shoulder briefly. Understanding passed between them without words. Guilt was a luxury they could not afford. Action was the only currency that mattered now. They approached through the back lots, staying low among the chicken coops and vegetable gardens. Most families were gathered near the church, their voices carrying across the evening air in heated discussion. The community was fracturing under pressure, fear driving wedges between neighbors who had stood together through seasons of hardship. The church door stood open. Lantern lights spilled across the wooden steps where children had played just days before. Now those same steps bore the weight of impossible decisions and the bitter taste of betrayal. Reverend Isaiah Cross stood at the pulpit, his hands raised in a gesture that begged for calm. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had wrestled with conscience and found it wanting. Around him, families argued in voices tight with desperation. Zara had known Cross since childhood, had learned her letters in this same church, had listened to his sermons about justice and mercy and standing with the oppressed. Now she heard different words falling from his lips: compromise, accommodation, the wisdom of accepting what could not be changed. She moved closer to the window, Koa a silent shadow beside her. The conversation inside grew clearer with each step. Cross was explaining his negotiations with Cartwright, his attempts to find middle ground between absolute destruction and complete surrender. The railroad baron had made an offer. The families could keep their homes and their lives. The settlement could remain intact. All it would cost was one person, one troublemaker who had brought this disaster upon them all. Zara Harper would face justice for her crimes against progress. The community would be spared. Several voices rose in agreement. Fear made people cruel, turned neighbors into judges. Better to sacrifice one for the sake of many. Better to preserve what could be saved rather than lose everything to principle. But other voices objected. Sarah Johnson, whose husband had died building the schoolhouse. Thomas Wright, whose farm fed half the settlement. Mary Little Bear, whose children played with white and black children alike in the streets where tolerance bloomed despite the poisoned soil of the wider world. They spoke of loyalty, of the debts owed to someone who had stood with them against claim jumpers and drought, and the thousand small cruelties that tested frontier communities. Zara had never asked for gratitude, but some hearts remembered kindness even when survival demanded forgetting. The argument grew heated. Families that had shared harvests and sorrows now faced each other across an unbridgeable divide. Cross raised his voice, calling for order, but authority meant nothing when civilization itself was crumbling. That was when the truth emerged. Cross had already made his choice, had already sent word to Cartwright through channels that bypassed Sheriff Hawkins. Federal marshals were coming, he claimed. Men who would investigate Zara's crimes and restore order to the territory. But not federal marshals. Cartwright's hired guns wearing borrowed badges. Men who would stage a trial that ended with convenient justice and permanent silence. Koa's hand found his knife handle. Zara shook her head slightly. Violence would only confirm their enemy's narrative, would turn them from seekers of justice into the outlaws Cross was painting them to be. The meeting dissolved into smaller arguments. Families gathered their possessions and made their separate peace with conscience. Some would stay and hope for mercy. Others would load their wagons and seek new homes in distant territories where Cartwright's influence had not yet spread. Cross remained at the pulpit as the church emptied. His shoulders sagged under the weight of choices that would follow him to the grave. He had genuinely believed in his compromise, had thought he could save his flock by feeding the wolf that stalked them. Now he would learn the price of trusting predators to honor bargains made with prey. Zara and Koa withdrew to the shadows as families scattered to their homes. The settlement felt hollow now, emptied of the fellowship that had once bound strangers into something approaching family. Fear had accomplished what drought and disease had never managed. It had broken the spirit that made survival worthwhile. They made their way to the railroad tracks that bisected the valley. Steel rails gleamed in starlight, carrying promises that turned to ash in honest hands. The weapons shipment would arrive in less than 6 hours, their last chance to gather proof that could save what remained of Copper Ridge, or their last chance to die with honor intact. Koa knelt beside the tracks and placed his palm against the cold metal, feeling for vibrations that would announce the approaching train. His face held the calm of a man who had made peace with whatever came next. Zara touched Marcus's medallion through her jacket. Her brother had faced similar choices 5 years ago, had chosen principle over safety, justice over survival. Now she walked the same path, carrying his courage into darkness that might have no dawn. The rails hummed with distant thunder. Somewhere to the east, a locomotive was building steam for its journey into the mountains, carrying cargo that would justify warfare against the innocent, carrying the seeds of destruction disguised as tools of progress. Two unlikely allies crouched beside the tracks and waited for their moment of truth. The mountain wind whispered through the pines above them, carrying the scent of smoke and the echo of broken dreams. By morning, the rails would run red with consequence or gleam clean with justice served. The difference hung on courage measured in heartbeats and choices that could not be undone. The train rounded Devil's Bend at midnight, its headlamp cutting through mountain darkness. Koa had chosen the derailment point with careful precision, a curve where the locomotive would have no time to stop. A grade steep enough to ensure momentum carried the cars beyond the tracks. They had worked through the evening preparing their trap, loosened spikes, shifted rails just enough to catch the lead wheels. The work was dangerous, requiring them to lie flat between the ties whenever other trains passed through the valley. Now they crouched in the rocks above the tracks and watched their moment approach. The locomotive's whistle echoed off canyon walls, a steel song of progress and destruction. Behind it rolled a dozen cars marked with Cartwright's shipping brands. The engine hit their sabotage at full speed. Metal screamed against metal as wheels found empty air where solid track should have been. The locomotive tilted, fought gravity briefly, then surrendered to physics and mountainside. Cars jackknifed behind the engine, their contents spilling across the rocky slope. Wooden crates split open to reveal their true cargo: rifles, ammunition, artillery pieces that would never reach their intended buyers. Evidence scattered under starlight for all to witness. Koa moved down the slope with fluid grace, his camera ready to document what they had uncovered. Each photograph would tell part of the story: weapons marked as farming equipment, bills of lading bearing forged signatures, the physical proof that paper trails could only suggest. Zara followed, gathering documents that had spilled from an overturned mail car, correspondence between Cartwright and his buyers, payment schedules for arms dealers who sold death to the highest bidder, names of federal officials who had been purchased or intimidated into cooperation. The crash had been heard for miles. Already lights were moving in Copper Ridge as curious residents came to investigate. Soon Cartwright's men would arrive, followed by whatever law remained honest in this corner of the territory. They worked quickly, documenting everything before evidence could be destroyed or witnesses silenced. The camera clicked steadily as Koa captured image after image, proof that would survive even if they did not. Voices echoed from the valley floor, multiple groups converging on the wreckage from different directions. Some came seeking truth. Others came to bury it beneath convenient lies and purchase testimony. Sheriff Hawkins arrived first, his badge gleaming in lantern light. But he was not alone. Federal marshals flanked him, their faces hard with purpose. Real marshals this time, not Cartwright's hired actors. Someone had finally heard the truth above the noise of corruption. Cartwright himself appeared as dawn touched the eastern peaks. His pale eyes surveyed the wreckage with the cold calculation of a man counting losses. He still commanded a small army of hired guns, but their confidence had evaporated with the night. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, scattered across acres of mountainside where no amount of money could hide it from honest investigation. The photographs would reach newspapers. The documents would fuel federal trials. Justice would finally have its day. Cross emerged from the cluster of townspeople who had gathered at the wreck site. His face carried the weight of choices that had nearly damned his community. He approached Zara with hesitant steps, his hands empty of everything except regret. The apology came in whispered words that barely carried over the morning wind. He had believed in compromise when principle was required, had chosen what seemed safe over what was right. Now he would spend whatever years remained making amends for weakness disguised as wisdom. The marshals took Cartwright into custody as the sun climbed above the peaks. His empire of corruption collapsed with the mountain dawn, built on lies that crumbled when exposed to light. Sheriff Hawkins joined him in chains, his badge finally stripped away by honest hands. Families began returning to Copper Ridge as news of the arrests spread through the valley. They came back to burned buildings and scorched earth, but also to hope that had seemed lost forever. They would rebuild as they had built before. They would endure as they had always endured. Zara stood beside the twisted rails where her own death had been scheduled just days before. The iron that had threatened to end her story now gleamed with morning light, promising journeys to places where justice might flourish. Koa approached carrying a leather pouch that contained their collected evidence. The work was finished, but the partnership would continue. There were other settlements threatened by other Cartwrights, other communities that needed champions willing to stand when standing seemed impossible. He removed Marcus's medallion from around his neck and placed it gently in Zara's hands. The silver was warm from contact with living skin, heavy with the weight of brotherhood and sacrifice. Her brother's legacy, returned to family hands but forever linking three souls across the boundaries of race and time. The railroad would still come to Copper Ridge, but now it would bring prosperity instead of displacement. The tracks would carry families seeking new homes rather than refugees fleeing destroyed ones. Progress would serve the people instead of consuming them. Trains began running again within a week, their whistles singing different songs across the valley. Songs of hope instead of threat. Songs of justice earned through courage and paid for with the coin of principle. Zara and Koa stood together on the platform they had helped preserve, watching locomotives carry mail and supplies and dreams toward distant territories. The mountain wind whispered through the pines above them, carrying stories of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things when the moment demanded greatness. The medallion caught sunlight as it rested against Zara's chest. Marcus would have been proud of what his sacrifice had accomplished. His death had planted seeds that flowered into justice for people he had never met but had died protecting. In the distance, new smoke rose from Copper Ridge. Not the smoke of destruction this time, but of cook fires and forge fires, and the warm hearths of families who had learned that home was worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth the price that heroes pay to preserve what matters most. The rails stretched endlessly in both directions, carrying the promise of tomorrow into places where courage might be needed again. Zara and Koa would follow those rails when duty called, united by bonds forged in mountain darkness and sealed with the blood of martyrs. Justice had found its voice in the high country, and that voice would echo across the territories wherever the innocent needed champions and the oppressed required hope. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.